Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for people to join. I'm going to give folks a minute or two to get settled, and I would love if those joining us this evening could please type in the name of the traditional territory that you're joining from. And there's a link in the chat to nativeland.ca if you're unsure of whose territory you're joining from. And while everyone is doing that, I will get started with introducing myself. I am Shelley Luce. I'm the campaigns director at Sierra Club BC. And I want to say welcome, everyone. If you're having any technical issues, please message Aurora in the chat and she will be able to help you. And I want to let everyone know that tonight's session is being recorded and therefore can be shared with the more than 900 people who've registered this evening. So excited to have so much interest in this really important topic. I'll begin by acknowledging that I am on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. I'm very, very grateful to be here, and I feel the responsibility of supporting Indigenous rights and title and Indigenous stewardship of these lands. And we start in a good way by showing up with the intention of honoring Indigenous rights and title and talking tonight about all the beings and how to better steward this land. This is a critical moment for the web of life on Earth and for climate and biodiversity. We have lots of targets and we have a ways to go to meeting them. The good news is that many, many people across different communities and Indigenous territories in BC and Canada are working really hard. Both federal and provincial governments as well have made big commitments to work with First Nations to protect habitat and biodiversity and in other ways. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, and I'd like to get started right now. We're gathered here around a wonderful book called Signs of Life, Hope in an Era of Extinction. This book was written by Sarah Cox, who's joining us tonight as one of our panelists. And our other panelists are Spô'zêm First Nation Chief James Hobart and Sierra Club BC Senior Policy and Science Advisor Jens Wieting. And I'll give a little bit more introduction of each of them before we get into questions. But just as a little bit of an introduction to Sarah's book, I just want to say that British Columbia has the highest biodiversity of any province in Canada and is also home to the most species at risk of extinction in the country. From the northern spotted owl to the woodland caribou to our beautiful old growth trees, so many beings are at risk of being lost forever if we don't act. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. So we'll start with environmental journalist Sarah Cox. Sarah has witnessed what happens when we drive species to the brink of extinction. And in her recently published book, Signs of Life, she joined Canadian military personnel, Indigenous guardians, biologists, conservationists, and lots of ordinary people across the country who are racing to save the habitats of hundreds of species before it's too late. You can find information on where to purchase Sarah's book in the chat. And if you haven't read it, please pick it up. If you have, make sure to talk about it with your friends and family and on social media, because these stories really helps all of us and these species at risk when these stories are known. So I'd like to start by asking Sarah about your book, which starts and ends with spotted owls. They are kind of a through line in the book. So can you share how you first learned about spotted owls and why you consider them such an important example of what is happening in Canada with biodiversity?
Sure, and thanks so much, Shelley, for the introduction and for hosting this webinar. I'm here today on the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And I think 6 years ago, I didn't know a whole lot about spotted owls. Of course, I knew that they lived in old growth forests, that they were dependent on old growth forests for nesting and to raise their young. And I was also aware that in the 1990s, spotted owls were at the forefront of battles to try to save old growth, both in Canada and the US. And US mill towns at the time featured mock spotted owl soup and pickled spotted owl eggs on restaurant menus, and stores sold t-shirts and bumper stickers that said, "Save a logger, eat an owl." The head of the IWA, the union representing forestry workers in Canada, told the New York Times that he told his people that if they saw a spotted owl to shoot it. So spotted owls were very controversial. And then we heard very little about them for quite a long time. And I really hadn't thought about them until a press release landed in my inbox about 6 years ago. And it said that I could watch Canada's most endangered owl on a webcam in a captive breeding center in the Lower Mainland. Well, this definitely caught my interest and sent me on what has been really a 6 year journey to try to understand in detail, not just as what has gone so terribly wrong with spotted owls, but with many other species as well. One measure of biodiversity loss is the number of species at risk of extinction. And in BC right now, that's close to 2,000. And that's officially, that doesn't include species that are waiting to get on the list or species that we need more information about. And across Canada, there are about 5,000 wild species at some risk of extinction, and 900 of them are critically imperiled, meaning they may soon be lost. And these include species of great cultural and spiritual value to Indigenous peoples like caribou and wood bison. And they also include species found nowhere else in the world but in Canada. The Vancouver Island marmot, for instance, right here on Vancouver Island where I live. And the story of the spotted owl for me highlights our failures to protect, again, not just spotted owls, but all species. In the 1980s, when scientists first sounded the alarm about dwindling spotted owl populations in Canada, there were still dozens of spotted owls left in BC's old growth forests, which is the only place in Canada where they've ever been found. And then about 20 years ago, when the species was listed as endangered under Canada's newly minted Species at Risk Act, there were still 24 wild-born and wild spotted owls in BC's forests. Then fast forward to when I started writing this book, there were 3 wild spotted owls known living in BC's forest, including a breeding pair that successfully hatched 3 chicks over 2 years. Those chicks were captured and taken to the Spotted Owl Captive Breeding Center. And then when I finished writing the book, there was 1 wild-born spotted owl left in the wild, and now today there are none. And so why is this the case? It's a complicated story, but if you pull out to the big picture and look at protections for spotted owls and other wild species, BC has no standalone endangered species law, despite promising one in 1996 and several times after that. And the spotted owl is not protected. In BC, it is still legal to log a tree with a spotted owl nest as long as the spotted owl isn't actually in the nest at the time. And Canada, of course, has a Species at Risk Act, but that act automatically applies only to federal land. And in BC, that's only about 1% of the province. And that includes parks and post offices and military bases. And it takes a very long time for a species to be listed under that act. And decisions about listing are far too often political. And then when species are finally listed, like the spotted owl, it takes a long time to get recovery plans. And there's no cost affixed to those plans. And Canada has, under that act, the ability to step in and make decisions for provinces where there are threats to species at risks, survival and recovery. But Canada has only done this for 2 species in the 20-year history of the Act, and they did not do it for spotted owls. So the owl, again, was listed under the Species at Risk Act 21 years ago, and today, at the end of 2024, it still has no final recovery plan. So tracing the story of the spotted owl and looking at the plight of it and the efforts still ongoing today to try to bring it back from the very brink of Canadian extinction and looking at the failures all along the way to try to protect it is just, for me, emblematic of how we need to turn things around in Canada and how we need to do things differently. Because if we stay on our current path, we're going to have more spotted owls.
Yeah, I see how they're an important example of what happens when we don't take action. We just see over time, as you said, there were 20, there were 5, there were 3, there are none. It's a heartbreaking thing to witness. So in the book, you talk about the crazy and often crazy expensive efforts to save these species on the brink. For example, the breeding facility and program that BC government has spent millions of dollars on while continuing to permit logging in the ever smaller old growth ecosystems that the owls rely on. And there are other examples like this. Can you talk about how this completely opposing actions can be occurring under the same BC government?
Sure. So governments, including the BC government, tend to jump in and take action at the 11th hour when a species like the spotted owl is on the brink of local or broader extinction. Very little happens up until that point. And so, for example, we can look at the Spotted Owl Breeding Center, the first of its kind in the world. No one else had ever tried to breed spotted owls in captivity before. And there are very intensive efforts that have been going on for a decade and more now at that center by very well-intentioned people, including scientists. And when we look at like exactly what we are doing while the government is continuing to approve clear-cut logging in spotted owl habitat, we can look at the center where there are about 30 spotted owls in captivity last time I checked, including the last but one owl taken from BC's wild and put into the captive breeding center. And it turns out that spotted owls in captivity don't like to breed. So the eggs are taken away from spotted owls who actually manage to have an egg that is fertilized, and they're hatched in incubators while forest sounds play in the background. The young owls are fed pieces of rat muscle on tweezers. They're put back into a nest, sometimes with foster parents when they're about 10 days old. They are in efforts to kind of boost the owl's sperm count. The rats that are bred at the center and euthanized are fed a diet high in selenium. There's just like one intervention after another. And this is what happens when we leave things until the very last minute. And when we look at what this has cost too, it has cost BC taxpayers more than $4 million to date to have this very well-intentioned breeding center whose purpose was to put spotted owls back into BC's wild, to raise them, to release them, and to bring the population back from the brink of extinction. Well, things haven't quite gone according to plan. And spotted owls are far from the only species where there are these elaborate, well-intentioned, very expensive efforts. We are flying wood bison sperm on Air Canada from Saskatchewan to Toronto, where there are elaborate efforts underway at the Toronto Zoo to try to scrub wood bison embryos free of disease and implant them, mostly female embryos, into captive wood bison so that wood bison populations can be restored. At the same time, there's logging and oil and gas development proposed for wood bison habitat, just as there's clear-cut logging in spotted owl habitat. We've lost black-footed ferrets in Canada. They have been again brought back from the brink of extinction in the United States, where they are also cloning black-footed ferrets. The first successfully cloned black-footed ferret was named Elizabeth Ann, and her first birthday was celebrated with a birthday cake made out of kibble and minced prairie dogs. we are breeding Vancouver Island marmots in zoos and sending them to Vancouver by plane and then trucking them to Vancouver Island, where they are put under anesthesia and surgically implanted with transmitters. This has actually helped bring the marmot back from the brink of extinction. And there are other efforts underway to try to prevent more clear-cut logging and habitat that allows predators to go in and dine on Vancouver Island marmots. But I guess the point that I'm making is that while we are putting money and incredible efforts into these last-minute efforts, we're continuing to destroy the very things that these species need for their survival. Old-growth forests for caribou and for spotted owls. Again, going back to the spotted owl example, the BC government says it has protected sufficient habitat for 250 breeding spotted owls. On the other hand, when you look at where that habitat is, it includes wildlife habitat areas that have specifically been set aside for the spotted owl, but logging is permitted inside some of these wildlife habitat areas. Last year, I went to one in the Lower Mainland with the Wilderness Committee. I also visited one on Spô'zêm First Nations territory with Chief James Hobart, looking across where the last pair of spotted owls at the time were nesting and raising their young. And that wildlife habitat area designated for the spotted owl was bisected by a logging road that we drove along.
So that's the part that's really shocking. I found really shocking in your book, and that I can't quite wrap my head around. I guess it's different ministries or different agencies that are responsible for the two different programs. There are commitments and contracts and things like that in place for logging. It does seem like it would make much more sense to put these programs together, at least put the pieces together so that we understand that there's no point, or it's a million times harder to breed owls in captivity than to preserve habitat for owls and make that move. So that's something that your book really highlights in kind of an undeniable keep you up at night way. So I really appreciated that in reading your book. I would really love to hear if writing this book changed your perspective on preserving species and habitats, and if so, in what big ways?
I think it not so much changed my perspective on conservation as enlarged it. And in doing the research for this book, which I managed to visit 8 of the 10 provinces, the book focuses on Southern Canada. I think I really realized that there's no one size fits all solution to species extinction and biodiversity loss. We tend to wait for governments to do something and pressure governments to do something, and very little action is forthcoming. There is some, but it's not nearly enough for the gravity of the biodiversity crisis. And so we can't only depend on governments to solve this problem. And then in visiting projects and efforts and people all across the country who are doing something to try to turn things around for at-risk species and biodiversity, one thing I learned about is a concept called priority threat management, which is in place in Australia and New Zealand. And what this concept does is it addresses threats to at-risk species across ecosystems. It doesn't just look at it species by species. This species is in peril. We're going to have a plan. We're going to save this species. It looks at things across an entire ecosystem. It finds common threats to multiple species, and it also costs out what it will take to address those threats. And so, for example, when researchers involved in priority threat management, led by Tara Martin at the University of BC, looked at the Fraser River estuary at the mouth of one of the world's largest salmon-bearing rivers and supporting the highest concentration of migrating birds in the country, they found that if we were to invest $380 million over 20 years, that would give all 102 species in the estuary a greater than 50% probability of persisting over 25 years. And that's only $15 million a year, or $3 for every person in the province, which is not a lot of money in the big scheme of things. And so I think we must begin to attach budgets and costs and talk about the cost of recovery efforts and the cost of preventing species from getting to the point where we can only have them in captive breeding programs. And so I also came to realize, I think, that much progress can be made locally. In 2019, a very important United Nations study came out, and it said that up to 1 million species around the world face extinction. And it also said that it's not too late to turn things around, but that action needed to happen on every level. And I think I really saw that in doing the research for the book, that things were happening on a local level right across the country, and that everybody can do something, from planting bee and bird friendly gardens and balcony boxes, to leaving leaf litter for insects, to making sure new housing development goes up in a way that doesn't harm ecosystems like the endangered Gary Oak ecosystem. There's so much that can happen on a local level, and I think that is how my perspective on conservation has shifted a little bit.
Thank you. The situation when we talk about one species or another can feel quite hopeless. And your book is called Signs of Life. And you do find hope in the stories that you're telling. So I don't know if you just described some hopeful things that can be done. Is there any one of the examples from the book that you want to highlight as something hopeful?
Sure. And I don't think I would do the work that I did if I didn't have hope. And I really did find hope in surprising places when I was researching the book. And one of them was on military bases. I had no idea that military bases across the country are havens for biodiversity. And because they are automatically covered by the Species at Risk Act, a lot of bases have biologists who work with the military to make sure that military maneuvers and bombs and everything else that the military does doesn't harm species at risk. Like, they will do things like say, can you wait until after these songbirds have fledged before you go into this area? Or that tank maneuvers can actually mimic the traditional role that bison have played in prairie ecosystems. So there are things going on right across the country, and in a lot of places, individuals are not waiting for governments to take action. In northern Alberta, there's a First Nation that has a project called Caribou Patrol, and they are literally helping endangered caribou cross a busy highway, making sure that they don't get hit by vehicles. On Vancouver Island, there's a group of wetland stewards that have built an underpass along a busy highway going to Port Alberni for at-risk red-legged frogs and other amphibians. And they call themselves SPLAT, which I read stands for the Society for the Prevention of Little Amphibian Tragedies. So it's nice to see groups bringing humor into what could be a dark situation as well. And then in Nova Scotia, I talked to a woman, a gardener and writer, who, along with other people, had gone out to protect endangered mainland moose habitat by camping out in a forest. And while they were there, they decided to look for at-risk lichens. They were there for weeks in the middle of winter, and so they found out, and over the course of weeks, they found some endangered lichens, which, because Nova Scotia does have an endangered species law, it required putting a buffer around each occurrence of these endangered lichens. And by the time that the government came in, sent their own scientists in, the buffers were put all around the endangered lichens. It was uneconomical to log the mainland moose habitat and the forest. So there are the creative and innovative things happening right across the country. There are so many people working on so many levels to turn things around. But we do have to get cracking, and people like Chief James Hobart, who you're about to hear from, are doing just that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I am very excited to introduce to you Chief James Hobart of the Spô'zêm First Nation in the Lower Fraser Canyon here in BC. Under Chief Hobart's leadership, the Spô'zêm First Nation has successfully pushed for logging deferrals in the Spô'zêm and Utslias watersheds, which are critical habitat for the spotted owl, and have championed not only the owls, but also the cultural heritage that they represent. So, Chief Hobart, I would welcome you to introduce yourself and also tell us a little bit about not only the Spô'zêm First Nation's efforts to protect that old growth, but also the relationship of the Spô'zêm First Nation with spotted owls and the cultural importance of these beings.
Thank you. Absolutely. Hazuman Quenched and Squenched is my traditional name. It means the largest pool of water that reflects the most starlight. And I'll go back and thank you. And thanks, Sarah, for writing this. It's very important information. And thank you, Shelley, as well, for bringing us together here and for leading us. I think one of the things that I realized early on, you remember a song Bryan Adams sang, The Summer of '69, and it was important for me because when I look back, the summer of '69 was the first year that my mom was doing an expose on the northern spotted owl in her artwork. And that was a long time ago. And at that time, it was because we'd spent time in the woods and behind Spô'zêm as kids growing up. And she told us the stories of some of them were scary. The owl people were going to come and take us if we made noise at night in the tents. And so now I realize it was probably her way of keeping us quiet. But at the same time, those stories have lived on since time immemorial. They've been passed on. And so I think, the relationship that we have with spotted owl, and you're right, we've worked really hard to try to bring the awareness throughout the nation, but also to industry. And that's been the biggest wheel to steer, I think, is the one with industry. And part of it, we hope that the government was going to give us a lot more assistance doing that. And it's been a challenge in that regard because, I think that they still have to pet both sides of the critter, if you excuse the expression. They have to still, placate the logging industry to some degree. But at what point do we step back and go, before we have to change, we need to change. And also before we take away all the imagination for the next generation of what they can do with what's left, if we don't leave them anything, what are we telling them? What's the message for our next generation that we don't trust the earth? We don't trust that the ecosystem, that we're doing some stuff that is playing almost like a nut and shell game with what's left. And I don't think that that's fair. That's not fair for us to be considering. For what? For us to make a bit more money here or there, and I don't know that, when I'm listening to Sarah, I know that she's done so much work on all the different species. And what I'll say is in our territory, we know that the spotted owl is a messenger of the old growth and what's happening up there. We don't even know what's up there, but we don't have to know. We just have to know that the spotted owl know and that they give us messages of what's going on. And to give people an understanding, there's medicines that grow at the bottom, and there's trees of origin that grow at the bottom of the old growth that don't grow at the second growth. There's nothing there. And so the old growth was here before acid rain. It's got a shelter that's huge, a canopy that really protects and some of probably the building blocks of life. And here we are, picking at it. And I always say this expression, how many ingredients can you take out of a cake recipe before it's no longer cake? And I think that that's what's happening with the ecosystem. We're taking out things, and the government, they hide behind the word extirpation, which is really extinction. But the average person, if they don't understand that and I'm not trying to be condescending, if they don't understand that extirpation doesn't mean extinction. It just doesn't mean extinction on the planet. It means extinction in that area. So we have extirpated stocks and animals all over the place, even our salmon. But because there's still one sockeye salmon swimming up the Fraser, there's not this level of risk that they put on or protection on these fish. And so it's scary to think that that's what we're dealing with. That's where things are at the hand. And as Sarah was saying, a lot of the things that are at the brink of the extinction, it's sad that we get it to that spot, or it gets to that spot. And then we try to really, really scramble to put the pieces back together when, why? Like, what was the motivating factor to just say, okay, you guys, let's have at her. And like you're saying, Sarah, about the comments about the spotted owl or any owls in the States, we had them here. We had a couple loggers last year say, "What? There's a spotted owl left in the territory. Let's get that thing in a microwave and get on with it." I want to. The message is that spotted owl aren't protection of the old growth. We are. If there was no more spotted owl, we still need to protect the old growth corridor. The loggers need to know that one less spotted owl doesn't mean one more tree can be cut down. There's other things that survive there. And I'll tell you a story about a biologist. He said that they were culling what's called the barred owl. And sadly, they're an invasive species. And they were culling the barred owls out of an area to try to release a spotted owl. And as they got rid of more and more, all of a sudden a female spotted owl showed up. And everybody was surprised. And so when I hear the numbers down to none, I think that there is more than that out there. So does Jared Hobbs, the guy that wrote a book on spotted owl. He believes, and he says he knows where there's some, but he's not going to tell anybody where they are, because we have to believe that they're still out there, and there's an optimism around that. And so we really do rely on the spotted owl as our messenger, but we also rely on the old growth. And when our elders want us to go get medicine, they don't tell us to go get it near the tracks or near the highway. We have to go into the deep old growth forest, and that's where you find the medicines. And so that's what's also at risk. People need to realize that there's just other things that we don't know that we don't know the benefits of some of those medicines that are up there. We have no idea. Like there's a lot of different things that I see happening, and there's a lot of things that it's affecting in my territory. And Sarah's right. We did a deferral on logging since 2021, and we don't want a deferral. We want a moratorium. We want to have it so that on a map, you look at an area, the loggers can look at it and go, "Wow, that would have been nice to go in there now." But look at there's that we can take that off our to-do list as ever going exploring or anything. Because the other thing that happened with Sarah, when we looked at where the spotted owl were, they don't just take the trees that are in the cut block. They take trees that are nearby because they can use them for cabling, and they're called collateral. They take those, and people don't realize that there's a lot of trees that go down that are in what's called a riparian area that are protected. But in a cut block, you're allowed to take them because you're allowed to use them to haul logs with. You're allowed to put a cable around it, which will kill them. But not only that, one of the largest slides in my territory has happened because of logging, and they logged some old growth, and the ditching was improper. There's no oversight in what's happening in my backyard in our territory. And that's the other thing, is that the thing is, I guess we need to just have people more aware that just because some things sound like the government is going forward and protecting and setting aside this or that amount of hectares, when you get down, ask the First Nations. And I'm not talking about, the First Nations that aren't near the old growth. I'm talking about the ones that actually experience watching the old growth get logged off at an alarming rate and have no way of being able to stop what's happening, and no way of teaching people out there that this is what's going on, because we're just a small group trying to make sure that in our backyards we're protecting it. And as you said, we've shut down the logging, but that's a deferral, and they still want to talk about when can we go back in there, and that's what we're up against. There's no place in the province, I don't think, that's safe, right now for logging, except for, like Sarah said, some of the federal lands. They recently took the donut hole out of the Manning Park. It was a place where exploration, logging, mining was going to happen. They said no more, but watch, because that amount of hectares is now going to be added on. They're going to go, this is protected here. Now we can take out of say Nahatlich or somewhere else, because that's what they do. They try to move these polygons around, and they'll say no net loss. The reality is that area was never going to be logged anyway because it was in the middle of a provincial park. But now that they've officially protected it, I'm scared that they're going to say, okay, we protected thousands and thousands of hectares here. That means we can open up somewhere else. And so watch for that. I'm watching for that as well. And I'll report back if I see anything. But yeah, it's a travesty what's happening in our woods right now. Kukshem.
Yeah, thank you for talking about all of that. And in particular, at the end there, you were daylighting a reality that most people have no idea about because most people aren't close to where it's happening or they aren't familiar with these issues. And I feel that the BC government has done a really good job of marketing itself and its logging industry as sustainable. And what you're explaining to us is what you know from the time you've spent on the ground is actually happening. And you mentioned that there's a lack of oversight. I think you mean by the province on logging companies. What can we do, because it is far from most people, to bring this to light in a more effective way? And I'm talking about environmental NGOs or journalists or others. If you have any thoughts on that, I would love for everybody here to learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Imagine there's an equation where they're talking about a balance of getting wood to the industry, and that's the case. And what happened here are government after government, they've inherited a problem. And back in the 70s, there was big companies that won awards, most sustainable logging practices in the world. Two companies. I think I knew the owners of both of them, both very nice guys, family guys. And they did that. They thought about the forest. But then a whole bunch of other companies rode in on the laurels. We're BC logging company, look at us. And the province turned a blind eye. A lot of the areas that I could show you that were supposed to have been properly managed weren't. There was no reforestation. There was no silviculture. There was no forest planning. So they ended up in court. And in court for 15, 20 years, the government won, but in that time, the government didn't replant. And so at one time, the whole forest was supposed to be taken care of by whoever logs it is supposed to also manage it, reforest it. They'd become a numbered company, they'd go bankrupt, and then what? The government would sit there in court. And at that time, I think that way back then, they should have said, okay, you guys get the logging. We're not going to pay you the amount. We're going to actually keep aside the amount. We're going to hire somebody else to do the planting and the reforest. That didn't happen. So in my own territory, there's areas that could have been replanted back in the 50s. They weren't. Instead, they went to court. They were found that, yeah, they should have been planting, but by now the deciduous are overrun, right? And so they'd have to go in there, clear it all out with all the deciduous and then try over again. It's not going to happen. And so they kept inheriting this negative in the industry. And they saw it coming. And they actually told us there's a gap that we're going to have to fill somehow with old growth. The reality is that gap doesn't exist. If you go to, and this is what people can do, and I've done this, I've driven all the way from here to, to Prince George for now. But I've had other friends drive up to like Houston Forest Products and stuff. And some of the mills are smaller now, but they have mountains and mountains of trees laying on the ground, all ready to be milled. And you know why they won't mill them? They said, well, those trees are too old now. They've been sitting there too long. They're going to be hard on the blades. But it's there. There's stock on the ground. And that could actually feed the softwood industry for a long time. But the problem is it's going to cost us more for blades. There's dirt in it now. We use that for dunnage. They have trees the forests and forests of trees that there's never going to be enough. They'll never use it for dunnage enough. They have to start cutting it. And so you would think that right now would be a time where they could start transitioning. So I think if I was to say that what needs to happen is there's going to be two transitions that have to happen. Cut what's on the ground that's already laying there at the mills, but also start talking about transitioning the ways we do things. We see a lot of construction happening with concrete, and that has its own issues. But right now, there's also people using other types of wood that are not part of the old growth, and there's also steel studs. People are saying that they're working out good. And I know I'm maybe just trading one issue for another, but the thing is that you're not going to find an old growth tree and make a 2x4 stud out of it. There's no way. those old growth trees that get cut down, like that's some of the richest aromatic wood, and they're using it for fencing and, fence panels and stuff and cedar shakes. And it's sad because there's other things that can be used, but there's this romance around building things the way they used to, I guess, and how it looks nice, but really, I think that people need to become more aware of the world around them. And again, I don't want to ever sound condescending, and just look and see, wow, there's a whole city block full of wood there, or 10 city blocks of wood at that mill, and yet they're saying that they still need to log. What about that wood? And realize that that wood is there. It's millable, but they won't mill it anymore. And as the days click by, that wood starts they start taking it off that end and cutting it up for firewood or sending it to pulp. When the initial reason why that was cut was for 2x4s and 2x6, coastal, all of that other type of lumber, and they're not doing that. So really, if the logging industry wanted to actually give trouble to somebody, it should be, hey, we've given you all the stock. Why aren't you really managing it the way that it should have been? And again, we need to transition the main logging companies out of that. And I've even said to the government, I will write support letters to those companies to help them transition out of it. Help them do something else. Go to university. I mean, they do that with other things. It's gonna happen anyway. So why not get ahead of the ball and have it happen? Extent.
It's something that we can plan for and make smoother for everyone involved if we face the reality of it. Thank you for that. If I could ask you one more question, I would love to hear a little bit about the importance of Indigenous guardian programs, and if we need to better support these programs in order to take better care of biodiversity.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so the Guardian programs are just starting. It seems like it's been in place for a long time, but the funding is slowly making its way down to where we can be out on the land and looking. Imagine this: you're sitting there during the heat dome when Lytton fire burnt down to the ground, and we did voluntary guardianship. There was supposed to ban a ban on all logging, and this is an earlier question that you asked: a ban on logging during a heat dome. And we saw logging trucks coming out by our guardians who were volunteer, donating their time watching. Logging trucks were coming out of the woods during a heat dome. And so when we went to the forestry and said, what's up with that? Like our families are living with almost PTSD because Yale or Lytton just burned half a month ago, and we're seeing this in the woods. And they said, oh, okay, well, compliance to the ban is voluntary. And so that there's a high level of trust that the government is putting on the companies to do the right thing. And the companies, are they? Maybe some are, some aren't, right? And so the guardianship program that we have started is having people out on the land in the territories. And who else better? And I'm not saying the First Nations, who else better than anybody, than somebody that walks around their backyard to know what's happening in their backyard, right? And so we are on the land in those areas, in the areas I'm speaking of. And so we know, but I'm just saying anybody that's out there on the land knows what a guardianship would look like. You're there looking at different things. You're seeing, changes in the forest. You're also that are negative, maybe by climate change, but you're also seeing debris being brought in, people, maybe animals being killed, maybe some negative impacts on the environment through different means, through exploration or road construction. And so there's a relationship with the nation. And really, you're right. The government has been asking us to report back some of these things, and they've been helpful with the engagement around that. So we are moving in the right direction around guarding and reporting and observing the things. But how do we put a stop to it, and how do we reverse some of those things? It's all, we have to all be working together. And as you know, nations, we have huge meetings every 3 months, the First Nations do, and we talk about these things. And so it is a really good, we have a really good grapevine, you might say, that has information going right across BC within every 3 months, stuff that's important to us, and we talk about it. Just as recently, we have been promoting, or we've got a call out from the biggest political Indigenous leadership groups in BC that they're going to promote what's called the personhood for things like old growth corridors. That is huge. If you understand what personhood is and you want to help do something, get behind that. It's actually we didn't want to do it. It's a game changer, and it's going to be right now. We're working with the government to do this. And if you understand what's happening, it's not like the pendulum had to swing that far, but when it does, it's going to be a far swing. There's going to be places that are going to be so protected that they're never going to be able to be logged again, whereas responsible logging might have happened in those areas. But because the pendulum swung so far to industry, we've had to use other means to push it back. And yeah, it's going to be a scary time for the province and for the industry, but we have to do something for the next generation for sure.
Thank you. Those are some hopeful messages you bring up there, and I appreciate it. Now I would like to introduce Jens Wieting. He is Sierra Club BC's Senior Policy and Science Advisor, and he has over 20 years of international experience protecting forests and supporting climate action, guided by the realization that we cannot stabilize the climate without intact forests, and we cannot save intact forests without a stable climate. So there's a lot of work to do. Jens, I'll start with asking you a question. In the last few years, the BC government has made a number of commitments that sound really good on paper, from the Nature Agreement to 30 by 30, the Ecosystem and Biodiversity Framework, Old Growth Protection and DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in BC. At the same time, old growth forests and other fragile ecosystems continue to be cut down and damaged by industry. So I would like to ask you, what do we need to see some change on the ground?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and really inspired by listening to my fellow panelists. I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and listening to you, I have to share with you that it was a powerful reminder about growing up in the degraded landscapes of Northwest Germany, and the reason why I'm still here, because this part of the world is still vast and beautiful, and there's still so much left that we have to fight for to save. And we heard about ecosystems and species falling through the brinks, through the cracks, and we heard stories about landscapes and communities of hope. And I'm going to share a little bit about some of these promises and commitments, Shelley, that you asked me about, that we need to become reality to turn things around, because we are really close to the brink. So I don't have slides, but I have this background pointing out three important ones. You heard about them: the Old Growth Strategic Review, the Draft Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework, the Nature Agreement. And I'm going to briefly share 2 or 3 things on each of them, why they are so important. And there's one thing that they have in common, Shelley, and that's that we have really meaningful commitments from colonial governments to bring about change with working with First Nations, but we are not seeing the change on the ground. And the folks who wrote the Old Growth Strategic Review pointed this out as a warning on page 1. Had previous old forest strategies and recommendations been fully implemented, we would likely not be facing the challenges around old growth to the extent we are today. That means high risk to loss of biodiversity, risk to potential economic benefits due to uncertainty and conflict, etc. So it's a pattern, and we have to break it. We have to follow through on these commitments. And in the context of the OGSR, 3 quick things: the deferrals. So we really need, the scientists call this stop the bleeding. We need interim solutions to make sure that nations and governments have time to implement the long-term solutions. This means that we need deferrals, logging deferrals for the most at-risk old growth. We need milestones to implement these things, milestones with dates, so that we can have some accountability. And there's a lot of hope now that with these commitments, we will have a new approach to landscape planning, to forest landscape plans. But we need folks on the table, at the table, who get assertive about ambitious targets, because without some targets for ecosystems, it will be a negotiation again and again about the few trees that are left in some of these landscapes. On the framework, the biodiversity framework, which is actually one of the recommendations from the Old Growth Strategic Review, we need, again, timelines leading to legislation co-developed with First Nations. Thousands of people shared comments by last January. The BC government reported back 7,000 comments, overwhelmingly positive, and we expect a final framework and an implementation plan earlier this year, but we didn't get the final framework. We had an election. Now it's really important to remind everyone in government that we need the framework with a timeline, with implementation plan leading to legislation, really making biodiversity a priority, so that's no longer a negotiation. And a biodiversity office to counter the power of the industries whose interests are reflected in with the chief forester currently. We need something similar to make sure that we can in fact make biodiversity a priority. And we need targets for ecosystems so that we will move away from the current setup of protected areas. We have overwhelmingly higher elevation forests with small trees in protected areas. We have to make sure that at-risk ecosystems will be a priority in these new protected areas. On the nature agreement from last November, this is truly inspiring because it's a trilateral agreement agreed to by the First Nations, BC First Nations Leadership Council, BC government, and the federal government, and it has a lot of detail. It talks about annual updates. It has targets not only to achieve 30% protected areas by 2030, but also 25 by 25. That's next year. We're not getting there, but it keeps the pressure up, and we need annual updates. The first one is now overdue. And quite a bit of detail on critical habitat, spotted owl, on specific old growth ecosystems with hectare numbers that should be protected with the nature agreement. And on all of these, we need progress, and we need your help. We all have to go back to our newly elected MLAs and ask for these updates. The good news is that the BC NDP included all three things that I'm talking about in their election platform, and you all know how close this election was and how big the risk was to lose many of these commitments. And now it's a very close election outcome, but we can hope that BC NDP and Green Party MLAs will work together. And we all have to play a role to get the support we needed. The nature agreement included funding over $1 billion, and we need again progress to make it easier to tie funding to specific priorities and make it easier for First Nations, knowing that so many nations are between a rock and a hard place, having to choose between, in some cases, forced to choose between logging or unemployment in some cases. And we need a framework where we can move to a place where protecting something will not be the exception, resource extraction the default. That's what's currently happening, right? We have promises, commitments, funding, but somehow resource extraction remains the default. And we have to turn this around because there's not much left. It was so inspiring to hear about the spotted owl. Maybe it's still out there, and another example that nature is more generous than some of us deserve, but it's crunch time. All of this is happening combined with climate change, and we really need these solutions to hold on to the web of life and to help find solutions to stabilize the climate.
Thank you, Jens. You referred to making the change from prioritizing industry to prioritizing nature and the values of nature. And we sometimes refer to that as the paradigm shift. I appreciate you didn't use that jargon, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway, because it is something that's embedded in the Old Growth Strategic Review, and that's so deeply needed in order to change the way we are treating our lands and waters and beings right now. We've talked about the need for a law to protect biodiversity. Of course, we know that there are many laws embedded in Indigenous legal orders and traditions across the territories of British Columbia. What we don't have is a provincial law here in BC that industry, for example, would be compelled to follow. So can you talk about a little bit more specifically about the importance of implementing a biodiversity and ecosystem health law in BC? And I can't help but compare it to something like an Endangered Species Act or a SARA, Species at Risk Act at the federal level in Canada, and how an ecosystem health and biodiversity framework and law would be different.
Yeah, and it's one of the strongest recommendations in the Old Growth Strategic Review, because its recommendation 2 and explicitly talks about the need for legislation that makes protecting biodiversity a priority for all sectors. This is the part of the Old Growth Strategic Review where it's not just about old growth, not just about forests, but about all ecosystems. And the draft Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework refers to ecosystem-based management, which is also incredibly important because it really emphasizes representation, the fact that if we work together to protect lands and waters, we have to make sure that we set aside lands and waters of all different types and ecosystems, not just higher elevation, for example, wetlands, alpine meadows, the whole set of ecosystems with similar percentages. And we have an opportunity to bring together Indigenous laws and knowledge and Western science here. The hope is that using ecosystem targets, working with First Nations in territories across BC, that there will be land use plans, there would be new Indigenous protected conserved areas that capture the full range of species, habitat, of ecosystems, cultural values, and allow the traditional uses to continue.
Great, thank you very much for that. Well, what I would like to do now is have an open discussion among our panelists for a few minutes, and then we will start taking some questions from our viewers. So I welcome any of the panelists to ask each other questions. And I can start just by mentioning something that really intrigued me, and I saw some comments in the chat popping up about it too, and that is when Chief Hobart mentioned personhood. For, I think you said old growth corridors. It's been explored for rivers and other places. And so it's quite a different concept for us. And you mentioned that it would be game changing. So I'd love to invite any of our panelists to talk a little bit more about this concept of personhood. Could we start with Chief James?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years ago, I worked with some other people from Squamish and across my territory, and we went back to the Innu people in Three Rivers in Quebec, and we started. It was 2021 when the Magpie River was granted personhood, and it was an exciting time because this river, which was just flowing as the Fraser or any natural river that doesn't have a dam on it, it was up for grabs for different resources, water, damming, and diverting, and it became a personhood, and so it has all the rights of to live its life without any sort of infringement. And so as we started researching, we realized that it was something that isn't just granted to rivers, it's also granted to old growth. And if you look what happened to the Magpie River, there's such a tight lens on it now that I don't think you can even go to get a cup of water out of there without having to ask for it. So that's how you're going from a place where, okay, let's leave it and let's see what they can do with it, and let's have like the exploration. And exploration to me usually means they're going to find something, and if they find something, now the conversation goes to the next stage. And so we don't even want exploration. And imagine the places where people had some understanding that in the old growth there could have been some chance to take some of that wood. It ain't going to happen anymore, because anytime you're going to step into that old growth corridor, it's got the right to live its life out, to die. And if it dies and it falls, and people say, well, those trees are going to fall anyway, yeah, that's the right that forest has. And so where it helps us as nations is when we see nations as Jans was saying, around people logging for money, First Nations logging for money, and then asking for more money for the trees that they're logging, because even though they're stuck logging, they're going broke and they can't make the money. So they're asking the government for more cubic meter or more money per cubic meter. Instead, the transition will include them, getting out of that area where they don't have that. And how will it include them? Because the old growth corridor, when the government asks me, what part of Spô'zém's old growth corridor do you want to protect? Well, clearly all of it. But I don't want to protect Spô'zém's. I want to protect the Nahatlich. I want to protect Boston Bars. It's a linear corridor. I can't protect one part and then have it not protected elsewhere. So the idea to have it protected from one end to the other is exciting to me. And so no longer are there going to be any small pieces of the corridor getting picked at along the way by nations either, because now it's going to be it's going to have the rights that'll protect it. And it needs that, because look at right now we're watching the old growth. A few years ago, when there was a discussion where there was going to be like the old growth strategic review was happening, more old growth hit the mills and the scales than years before, because it was a panic. And I think what Jens was saying, there was an opportunity for the government to teach at I was at so many of those old growth strategic remove. I think it was Castleman that was putting it on. They never gave one handout of DRIPA. They didn't teach about DRIPA at those meetings. They had industry there, they had ministers there, and they had First Nations there. And it would have been like it would have been like a two-tier approach where there's industry and the people that were standing opposed. They didn't tell them, hey, now the First Nations actually have a tool now. Enter DRIPA. This is the lens that we're going to be looking at. And so I really think they dropped the ball there. And so I hope now that they're back in, that they really, help people understand that DRIPA was actually not to freeze the province. It's actually to make it so that the actual, in a lot of places, the industries are moving better now since DRIPA, because they don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on consultation and referrals to a nation that's going to say no anyway. Or maybe the nation will say, let's see what you want to do, and we'll tell you where it's better off done in our territory. And so there's those positive outcomes of that too. But people don't realize, unless DRIPA comes into play, those conversations aren't happening. And the better part is that industry is saying, wow, when we get to talk to the First Nations without going through all of these different processes, it's a one-to-one, and we're actually having some positive conversations around that. So I really think we're heading in a good direction, but I also think that yeah, that we really need to start implementing things like a personhood. Yeah.
It's a great explanation. Thank you. It's very hopeful to think that DRIPA can have positive outcomes like you described and provide what I'm always hearing industry craves, which is certainty. So rather than never-ending negotiations and consultations, an actual relationship building and coming to agreement on things. That would be very positive. Jens, you had something to add.
First of all, personhood is inspiring, the idea, because it would allow us to look, as you said, at things in a new way in terms of the Western moving beyond Western science and resource extraction, looking at our relationship in a more holistic way. And in this context, there was a question in the Q&A about purchasing old growth, whether environmental organizations should help buy lands. And I think that we have to go beyond that. We know that private property is not necessarily a good solution to protect lands and waters, particularly in this part of the world with indigenous territories that have existed for time immemorial, and so much harm done by privatizing lands as a result of colonization. And we have now opportunities, thanks to some lessons learned. They're not perfect, but some of the progress made in the Great Bear Rainforest, for example, with conservancies. At the time in 2006, this was a new type of protected area, negotiated with the nations in the region, explicitly allowing ongoing traditional use of the lands, and combined with conservation financing. More than 1,000 jobs got created in communities across that region with the $120 million of conservation financing. And now there are new commitments as part of the nature agreement and new expectations, because we have DRIPA since 2019, and we have a lot of resources to learn from First Nations on the concept of indigenous protected and conserved areas, which I'm sure can be combined with ideas of personhood. If we can see whole watersheds protected, for example, that would be fantastic. But the funding is needed to repair some of the damage, because in so many cases we need now efforts to restore damaged lands and waters, and we have to find funding to create jobs that will not further undermine ecological integrity. So I think this is the direction we have to go, and we have seen some good examples with the different levels of government and private funders contributing to $1 billion, and it will, at the end of the day, more will be needed if we want to get close to 30% by 2030, which is a hugely ambitious goal, with currently just about 16% protection in British Columbia. It would require to essentially protect around 3 million hectares every year. And we are currently looking at a few 100,000 hectares, which is inspiring. And there are beautiful examples in Clayoquot Sound and Clean Cesar, the caribou habitat in the interior. But we would have to see that increasing by factor 10 almost. And it will require a lot more funding to support indigenous-led conservation solutions.
Thank you. Any other responses from our panelists?
I was just going to add that personhood is catching on, not just in Canada, but around the world. And just a few months ago, the Peruvian courts ruled that the Maranon River in the Amazon was a person and had the rights of the person. And this is, extremely important because the river was under threat from everything from dams to oil and gas development, unscrupulous oil and gas development, and the Kunama Indigenous people rely on it to live and for their survival. So this is a huge win in Peru, and it again, personhood is one tool in a toolbox, and other tools in the toolbox have been discussed tonight. But in terms of better protecting biodiversity and species at risk of extinction, we need to be doing many things on many fronts.
Completely agree. Thank you, Sarah. I would like to ask the panelists, and Sarah, you touched on this earlier in your comments, what other roles, what other things anyone can do, concerned residents, other orders of government besides the BC government, municipal and federal, for example. What kinds of actions do you think are going to make a difference going forward? How can we all support biodiversity, both through First Nations sovereignty and Indigenous-led conservation, and all the way down to what's happening in our cities and towns?
I think it's really important to start on a local level, although we need to do much more than on a local level, even to find out what is going on in your own backyard, in your community. There are initiatives to try to have biodiversity laws at a municipal level, neighborhood initiatives, not just to protect what is left, but to restore what is gone. Everything kind of starts on a local level, and that's where people can dive in and start making a difference right away, while also holding governments accountable for the promises they have made for things like a biodiversity, an ecosystem health framework, and nature agreement. Like, governments have made promises, and it's up to people to hold them accountable for that.
Yes, thank you. Holding government accountable is something that lots of environmental groups, including Sierra Club, really strive to do. Sometimes it feels difficult. As we heard from Chief James, it can be like talking to a wall at times. I'm sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but you were talking about how difficult it can be to get the kind of oversight that's needed. And we have a question in the Q&A about BC timber sales appearing mismanaged and operating in an unsustainable way. And a lot of folks don't have a clear picture of when we say the province is allowing logging, we don't have a clear picture of what exactly that means. There's BC Timber Sales, there's a Ministry of Forests, and then there are other departments that are trying to protect endangered species and habitats. So can anyone kind of comment on this question? Is BC Timber Sales operating unsustainably, and what does that mean? And how do we tie that to holding government accountable?
I can comment briefly on it just by saying what people might not know, which is that BC Timber Sales is a government agency, and it auctions off the rights to log old growth in some of the last remaining old growth forests, including in Spô'zêm First Nation territory, and often in endangered caribou habitat as well. So it is a government agency. It has been in the game for a long time. And it almost seems sometimes to work at cross purposes to the government, because on the one hand, you have the government paying and taking action to do things like try to recover spotted owls. On the other hand, you have the same government, or different arm of the same government, going ahead and auctioning off the rights to log in that same habitat.
Yeah, Sarah's right. I think what happened is the government's got too many arms. And what happened, and you're right, that's we have I'll say that I'm not a fan of BC Timber Sales. When I first started working with them, I was looking at them as another open-minded agency of the government, but I realized afterwards that, there's one of the I guess one of the directors of the BC Timber Sales said to me, "You're going to be excited to know that we have First Nations hired in the timber sales," and I really wasn't excited about that because that to me seemed like assimilation. Like every time there's been some friction with an industry, let's get the natives hired into that industry, and then that's all it takes. And it's an old game, but the BC Timber Sales is being famous for that. They've started funding the First Nations Forestry Council, and First Nation Forestry Council has no way of shutting down forests. They have no way of shutting down the BC Timber Sales. It's like they've given us this arm of the BC Timber Sales. And Sarah's right. What happened was years ago, big companies were taking on the whole management process. And then it became too small a pieces of the pie. Now they're not breaking up pie, they're fighting around the crumbs. And so what was happening before, if a contractor came in, they would get the road, they'd have to build the road, they'd have to get the logs out of there, they'd have to maintain that road, they'd have to maintain the landings. It's a lot of money. So that's why logging was really a rich industry, right? As it turned out, after a while, when the logging became smaller and smaller polygons, nobody wanted it because why would I build that road into there just to take out those few trees? So what was created was the BC Timber Sales, and they were going to say, okay, the province now will own those roads. We'll build those roads and we'll start selling these little lots of logging and we'll manage it. And that was the problem, is that governments change, companies don't. The companies, the ones that were really steadfast at keeping, their reputation up here, they would go in and they'd build ditching and stuff. BC Timber Sales has okayed stuff in my territory where huge slides have happened. And they don't understand that if you don't ditch that road on the other side, there's going to be a washout. And BC Timber Sales will give a green light to it, and the company goes away and they don't have to come back. So our last little while in the BC First Nation leadership has been, we need to revamp the BC Timber Sales, and there needs to be First Nations on board on that, because we see what's happening, and we're better to manage what's happening on the ground than anybody. But what they say, well, we can have an advisor, of a First Nation advisor to the timber sales, and yeah, they are acting. They're not acting in a way that's conducive to keeping our forests in a sustainable way. Absolutely not. 100%. You can quote me on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very helpful history and context. Jens.
Also, sadly, they are symptomatic for the lack of imagination. They have to find 20% of the volume logged in BC supposedly to inform the market price by auctioning of that timber. And that means they are a consistent pressure to find the trees in landscapes where few remain. And it's the opposite of making biodiversity a priority. When we have lessons learned about respecting nature's limits, we know that instead of timber targets, we need ecosystem targets. We have to set new limits to protect and restore these ecosystems, and that would be consistent with some reciprocity, where we can look to Indigenous knowledge and understand that after taking so much, there's so little left, that the forests need a break. And there is an opportunity to reinvent BC timber sales, give it a new name, a new structure with First Nations leadership, and a new mandate to help restore the forests, when so much evidence that every day the value of the standing trees, of the ecologically intact areas, is increasing, and the value of the trees in terms of jobs, if we cut the trees down, is shrinking. Every year, every day, there are fewer jobs in the woods because it's all using big machines and fewer people working in forestry when so many of us depend on intact ecosystems, including our safety, our well-being, looking at the climate impacts, the flooding, the droughts, the fires. We have a lot of work that we have to pay for now to restore some of these ecological functions, and BC Timber Sales could play a role with a new name and mandate.
Great. Thank you, Jens. We're nearing the end of our time. I have a question from the Q&A that I would love to bring up, which shifts our conversation a little bit. The question is, can endangered ecosystems and species be talked about in terms of climate concerns?
May I jump in?
Please.
Absolutely. And yeah, of course, when we protect old growth, when we are protecting the home of the spotted owl and other at-risk species, we're also storing carbon. And so many climate and biodiversity solutions are one and the same. For example, grasslands in the prairies, where there are very few grasslands left, many species at risk of extinction. Grasslands also store carbon. And so when we're taking measures to protect grasslands, we're addressing climate concerns by storing carbon. We're saving habitat for species at risk of extinction, including songbirds, which are in huge decline. And there are many innovative initiatives underway, including from ranchers, to do just that. So I don't think we can talk about species at risk of extinction and biodiversity and climate separately. They are one and the same thing.
When I hear what you're saying, I think back of there's a ranch in the U.S. that was dying, and they went back to the indigenous ways on that ranch. A family bought it, and they started doing stuff the way the indigenous people did, and it started to flourish. And I'll tell you, our stories, our indigenous stories, didn't start in a bubble. They didn't start in a breeding center. And so when we put our animals in something like a breeding center, they're not. It's barely a stopover. It should be just a notion that's hoping to find the health to move them forward into their rightful place. Because we talk about umbrella species. Umbrella species, the help that an umbrella species can do in an ecosystem has no good in a breeding center. So whether we feel it's successful, and I've heard that we're more successful now because we have more spotted owl in the province, but they're all in a breeding center. And to me, it almost likens the very first time that, because BC, I would say that First Nations have always been part of the ecosystem. I feel that. I feel that with our salmon. I feel that with everything. And we were put in cages in a way. We were sent away to be taught in schools, residential schools. And here we are. I wonder what would happen if instead the newcomers would have said, wow, you guys are really connected to the environment. You're connected to the ecosystem. Here, please take our kids and teach them how you did that, how you're doing that, how different the earth would be. Because right now, it's the other way around. We're really trying to do a catch up. And I feel sad about that. I feel like there's some steps that we missed, and maybe as First Nations, we didn't indicate strong enough how frustrating it was to be part of an equation and then be taken out of it and then watch it happen and not really fight to have our rightful place set back into that ecosystem. Because when we participate, there's a lot of positive changes, and so we are here to participate. The First Nations in BC there's 204 First Nations, and we across Canada, we are looked upon as being those that are out setting some paces in every industry and every portfolio. So thank you. Thanks for allowing me to speak tonight.
Thank you very much.
Maybe this is also a good moment to highlight a few resources that you can find on our website. So we have several reports on issues like old growth and carbon, old growth and climate impacts. One report by Dr. Peter Woods called Intact Forests, Safe Communities. And it describes how many of the really severe climate impacts that we are now seeing, from droughts to flooding to landslides to heat waves, are influenced by logging practices and clear cutting, and why following through on the old growth strategic review recommendations will also help to at least reduce some of these climate impacts. But this is also a reminder that we have to phase out fossil fuels if we want to protect ecosystems, because we are crossing dangerous thresholds. The other way to quickly find more information, high-level information on some of the topics we discussed, is to simply go through Sierra Club BC media releases, our updates, our report cards on these commitments, Old Growth Strategic Review, Biodiversity Ecosystem Health Framework, Nature Agreement. You can use these to prepare for a meeting with your MLA, for example, or to use some of the wording for a letter, to give just a few examples. And we have new cabinet, new ministers. We have Ravi Parma is the new Minister of Forests, Randy Neal, Ministry Lands, Waters, Resource Stewardship, Tamara Davidson from Haida Hawaii is the new Minister for Environment and Parks, to name just a few. And I think they are flooded with meeting requests from industry right now, and we really have to make sure that they're hearing from everyone to keep them motivated, welcome them to their new jobs. Many of us are frustrated about the last several years, but there are some new faces, some new MLAs, some new ministers, and we have to allow for some level of hope that things can be different, that we can all wake up and hope for better outcomes in the next few years. And we really need it to inspire people around the world, including south of the border.
Thank you, Jens. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and to our panelists. Thank you, Sarah Cox, Chief James Hobart, and Jens Wieting, for sharing all of your experience. Thank you for Signs of Life, Sarah, and for sharing your experience and your knowledge and your feelings and your hope on these issues. It means so much to the hundreds of people who joined tonight and who will watch the recording, and certainly to us at Sierra Club BC and all of our supporters who are going to take what we learned tonight and use it to keep working for biodiversity and spotted owls and caribou and all the other species that need our care and stewardship. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.